So thank you very much for inviting me to give this presentation on an introduction to visual analytics. My name is Katerina Vrotsou, and I'm an associate professor in information visualization at the Linköping University in Sweden. And my research is focused on visual analytics approaches for analyzing various types of data, ranging from temporal event sequence data to urban climate data to social media text data. So what this involves, in essence, is the design and development of interfaces that combine visualization with algorithmic computation to enable the interactive analysis of data where the human expertise plays a central role. And this is what we will be talking about today. So let us start by defining visualization. Visualization is the process by which we interpret information. So say we have a set of data that we want to study and understand. We can create pictures that represent the data or aspects of them in some graphical form. And we can then look at this picture, and this helps us to understand something, gain some insight. So what we see on the screen, it's not a visualization, it's a visual representation of data. Visualization is what happens in the brain. It's the process of building our mental model, but we use visual representations in order to achieve visualization. So the reason why we use such representations is because the raw data into which people want to gain insight generally comes in a form that is not well suited for that purpose. So if we look at the visualization process, we could outline it as follows. So starting from the raw data, we perhaps want to perform some transformations first and then map this data to appropriate visual representations. Following this, we need to consider presentation, which is concerned with how we lay out our representations with respect to the sort of available screen space. The user can then look at these representations with which they often can interact by sort of transforming the view or rearranging, filtering, etc. And this will help them to understand something and gain some knowledge. And this set of representation, presentation, and interaction techniques is what we usually refer to when we talk about visualization. And the interactive process of viewing and interacting with the representations is referred to as visual exploration. So the visual exploration pipeline can then be simplified into this. But especially nowadays, as the access to data and the production of data continuously sort of increases, analysis by means of pure visual exploration becomes more difficult. And this is where sort of data mining and machine learning techniques come in very handy. But this is, of course, not problematic either. So because let's say that we have data, supposedly in an optimal world, we send it into an algorithm and out come sort of knowledge patterns inside. But this is often not the case because algorithms themselves often act as black boxes. And the user, who is usually not a machine learning expert, does not know really what is going on, what is being done. Perhaps they can control some sort of parameters into the algorithm, which then computes and recomputes and outputs sort of new results. And then the user needs to go through and find sort of the relevant aspects, the relevant knowledge from all these results, and needs to interpret what the outputs are. And this is not a non-problematic task either. In fact, interpretation per se can be quite tricky. And this is quite well illustrated by this example that's called the Anscombe's quartet, where we have 4 different data sets that have exactly the same statistical summaries. They have the same mean, the same standard deviation, the same correlation coefficient. And if we would look only at the statistical summary, then sort of we would be under the impression that these data sets are very similar. But by plotting them, we actually see a very different view. We see sort of that the curvature of the data and the potential outliers of the data can make a very big difference. And this sort of illustrates very well why it is important with visualization to create better understanding. And this is also where sort of visualization and computational models can assist each other. And this visual analysis process that sort of extends, in a sense, further than pure visual exploration to combine also automated data analysis with interactive visualization techniques and human-computer interaction has become sort of the center of a field that is called visual analytics. So visual analytics has been defined as the science of analytical reasoning facilitated by visual interactive interfaces. So visual analytics basically combines automated analysis techniques with interactive visualization for an effective sort of understanding and reasoning and decision-making on the basis of very large and complex data sets. So let's go through sort of all of the different parts of the process a little bit in more detail. So as we saw also before, the first step is often to pre-process and transform the data. So we perform certain computations in order to prepare the data for the upcoming analysis, maybe derive additional attributes, or derive sort of, typical data cleaning is a typical sort of data pre-processing, normalization, grouping, etc. So after we have sort of prepared our data, then the analyst can choose between two different paths. If an automated analysis is used first, then sort of data mining methods or machine learning methods are applied to generate models of the original data. And once a model is generated, the analyst has to evaluate and refine the model, which can be best done by sort of interacting with the data. If we sort of follow a visual data exploration path first, then the user has to sort of confirm certain generated hypotheses through sort of the automated analysis, and user interaction is often needed in order to sort of reveal more information, for instance, by zooming into different parts of the data or considering sort of different views, looking at the data from different perspectives. And then it's interaction between these two that makes things even more interesting. So model visualization can be used to evaluate the findings of the generated models, while the findings in the visualizations can in turn be used to steer model building in this automated analysis. And alternating sort of between these two, between the visual and automatic methods, leads to sort of a continuous refinement and a mutual reinforcing sort of loop towards gaining of finally knowledge or insight or new gems from the data. So this knowledge that is gained can then be fed back into the process to further refine the results, potentially by changing parameters, by adjusting the models, by adjusting the visualization, but even by sort of adjusting the input data per se. So if we were, let's look at the sort of concrete example of how a visual analytics approach could be applied, in this case to the field of sequential pattern mining. So if we define sequential pattern mining as given a set of sequences where each sequence consists of a list of events, and given a user-specified minimum support threshold, sequential pattern mining is defined or aims to identify all frequent subsequences whose occurrence frequency is set as to equal or higher than this minimum support threshold. And there are many, of course, algorithms for identifying this type of frequent patterns from sequences, but what most of them have in common is that a user sort of specifies a set of constraints to be put on the algorithm, for example, a minimum support threshold, and then the algorithm usually runs recursively until all the identified patterns, all the patterns that meet these constraints have been identified. And this is sort of a closed process that can potentially generate a very large number of output patterns, depending on how this threshold is being selected. So if we select the threshold too low, then we have many patterns that affect, of course, computation time. And if we select the threshold as too high, then we may have only the most obvious patterns as a result, which perhaps leads to less interesting analysis. So being able to sort of enter in this process and interact with it can be a very useful thing to do. So in visual analytics, there have been several approaches over the years that have looked into sort of creating visual analytics approaches for improving sort of and making this task more interactive. One example, one of sort of several examples, but is sort of to create, this is called Frequence, and it's an interface that basically is used to initiate sequence mining approach and explore the resulting patterns. So in this interface, a user has the possibility to define and redefine the pattern definition by, for example, adjusting the support threshold. And when they have done that, the algorithm sort of runs. And once all the results have been, all the patterns have been identified, the user can sort of visually explore them. In this case, since the patterns are subsequences of data, they are here represented in a so-called Sankey diagram. And the user now has the possibility to sort of filter the data, look at it at different levels of detail on the event descriptions, for example, or look at different lengths of the identified patterns. The drawback with this is while it gives a lot of power to the user to actually explore the results and maybe refine their sort of constraints and rerun the algorithm, the problem is that the algorithm still runs sort of in a recursive manner. So after any adjustment has been made, the entire process needs to be recomputed before the new results can come into play and be explored. In a sort of another approach to sort of making pattern mining more interactive is this interface that is called Eloquence, where what we have sort of aimed to do is try to embed sort of the domain knowledge more deeply into the analysis process, so to say. And this is done by, instead of letting the algorithm to run in a recursive manner, the user sort of steers the growing of patterns, sort of steers the pattern mining process stepwise. And this also opens up the possibility to sort of adjust constraints at each step of the computation, and so sort of have more local constraints that do not affect the entire computation, but affect sort of only parts of it. So in this interface, let's see if it starts. To the left, we have the pattern tree that basically acts as a mean to steer the algorithm. And to the right, we have the sequence view that allows a user to look at the patterns in the context of the sequential data set that they appear in. Patterns can be seen as sort of sequences of instantaneous events or with the associated event duration. And here the user sort of steers, like I said, the entire algorithmic process through this pattern tree and can adjust several constraints on the algorithm. There is a panel that allows sort of constraints and filters to be applied. And constraints can be applied in terms of this minimum support, but also in terms of sort of the gaps between the identified pattern events. So if if two events occur very far away from each other, then perhaps they are not considered part of the same event. So a user here can enter a minimum support threshold and start growing the patterns in the pattern tree. At any point of the computation, they can sort of readjust the constraints, and then from that point onward, the new constraints apply, which means that more coarse constraints can be set in the initial part of the computation, and then successively, as more sort of detailed, more patterns appear or longer patterns appear, you can adjust the constraint threshold in order to sort of flexibly navigate in the search space. So this approach gives the user the flexibility to actually explore the entire search space without being bound to waiting for the entire computation to finish before being able to look at the results. So these are two examples of visual analytics interfaces that have been focusing on the detection and exploration of patterns in event sequences. And the two approaches have sort of had different levels of interaction, in a sense, available or included in them. But if we take a step back again, and when we are designing data analysis tools in general, what is important to consider is their context of use. And this is often done by using sort of following a variation of the 5 W's, so-called. What, why, who, where, and when. So what refers to the data? There are many different types of data. Now we saw an example with sequential data. We could be dealing with network data, time series, census data, trajectory data, you name it. And all the different data types have different characteristics, scales, dimensionality, etc. And this is sort of very important to take into consideration when we're designing interfaces. The second W, Y, refers to the task. So the objective is to sort of help an analyst to achieve goals, but not all, or a user to achieve their goals, their tasks. But not the tasks may vary very much depending on the context of analysis, right? One could be one could be interested in identifying patterns in a data set, relationships, in comparing sort of different aspects. So considering what the actual analysis task that needs to be performed in the interface is very central. Who refers to the user? We need to think about who is going to be using our interface. Is it an expert? Is it a novice? What are their preferences? What are their goals? What are sort of their interests? All this needs to be sort of taken into consideration, of course. The where refers to the setup, and basically sort of is it, what is the display size? Are we dealing with sort of a normal desktop interaction? Is it a VR environment? That plays, of course, a very big role also in how a visual interface is designed. And finally, when refers to sort of the workflow. When will the data be analyzed? And there are sort of in certain domains, there may be specific sort of workflows that need to be followed, and each step may be associated with different requirements. And this naturally also needs to have a say in how an interface is designed. And so finally, extending further from these 5 W's, the visual analytics design triangle is something that is often sort of referred to in in the field, sort of when we are designing novel interfaces for different tasks. And the visual analytics design triangle aims to sort of summarize the important aspects that need to be considered during the design and implementation of the solutions. So it considers a number of influencing factors and a number of quality criteria. So in the corners, we have sort of the influencing factors being sort of the data, the users, and the tasks, which basically are 3 of the W's that we saw before. So what kind of data do the users are the users working with? Who are the users themselves that are going to use this interface, and what are the general analysis tasks that they need to be performing? And the answers to all these questions largely determine which representations should be used, which analytical methods, or which interaction methods should be used. Along the sides now of the triangle, we have sort of the 3 main quality criteria, so to say. And these need to be satisfied in order to obtain useful results. So the first criteria is expressiveness. A visual representation needs to be expressive, and this refers to sort of correctly or truly mapping data and tasks. And we can distinguish between visual expressiveness, which refers to sort of to the requirement of showing the desired information only, not misrepresenting the data, not hiding information. And sort of interactive expressiveness, which refers to the requirement that users need to be able to carry out the actions that are needed to acquire the desired information, and only these actions. Effectiveness refers to sort of how well users can extract or interpret the information needed from a visual representation in order to achieve the analysis task they want to perform. And finally, sort of appropriateness, or also referred to as efficiency, it refers basically to sort of balancing the benefit of using an interactive visual analytics approach needs to sort of, gain. It needs to be more than the cost it requires to, the cost on computational resources and human effort for achieving a task. So it's sort of a cost-value ratio, let's say. And with sort of the visual analytics design triangle, with its influencing factors and quality criteria, I'm thinking to sort of end this talk. That has sort of defined visualization. We have looked at what visual analytics are and what the visual analytics process looks like, and looked into an example of actually applying visual analytics methods, creating interfaces for applying visual analytics approach. And with this, I would like to say thank you for me.